My son invited me to his wedding, then asked me to sit in the back. After my divorce, my ex rewrote my role as a father. At my son's wedding, I realized I was invited only for appearances. The quiet choice I made that day reshaped our relationship and forced my son to confront the lies he grew up believing. When the usher glanced at my name and pointed me toward the back row, something inside my chest quietly folded in on itself. It was a small gesture, barely a movement of his hand, but it landed with the weight of a lifetime. The chapel smelled like fresh lilies and old wood polish. Soft music drifted from the speakers, a string quartet practicing patience. Guests murmured, programs rustled, heels clicked against stone. I stood there in my dark suit, the one I'd had tailored just for today, holding a small envelope with my son's name written on it in careful ink. "Father of the groom?" the usher asked, polite, distracted. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He nodded, smiled faintly, and gestured again. "Right this way." And that was how I found myself walking past rows of smiling faces, relatives, friends, people who'd known my son through different versions of his life, until the front rows were gone, until the air felt thinner, until I slid into a seat near the back wall, close enough to be seen, far enough to be forgotten. I sat down slowly, smoothed my tie, folded my hands together the way I always did when I needed to look calm. I told myself it didn't mean anything. Weddings were complicated. Seating charts were complicated. People made mistakes. But as I looked toward the altar, at the empty space where my son would soon stand, I felt the old familiar ache, the one I'd learned to live with since the divorce, the ache of being present but not quite included. Before all of this, before the wedding invitations and the careful phone calls, my life had settled into something quiet and predictable. I lived alone in a modest house on the edge of town, the same one my son had learned to ride his bike in. The maple tree in the front yard had grown taller than the roof now. Its leaves clogged the gutters every fall, and every fall I complained and cleaned them out anyway. I worked as an electrical inspector for the city. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. I liked the order of it. Checklists, codes, problems you could actually fix. My coworkers knew me as reliable, a little reserved, the kind of man who brought his lunch in a brown paper bag and never forgot a birthday. Most evenings I cooked for one. Simple meals, grilled chicken, steamed vegetables. On Sundays I made too much pasta out of habit, then packed the leftovers away with a small sigh. Sometimes I ate dinner at the kitchen table, sometimes standing at the counter, listening to the radio. My son, Daniel, called once every couple of weeks, more often if something was happening, an engagement announcement, a new job, a holiday approaching. Our conversations were polite, careful, like we were both walking around something neither of us wanted to name. "How's work?" he'd ask. "Same as always," I'd say. "How about you?" "Busy, good, wedding planning's a lot." He'd laugh, but there was always a tightness to it. After the divorce, things changed between us. Not all at once, not in a dramatic blow-up, just gradually. His mother and I ended things badly. Years of quiet resentment finally spoken out loud. Sharp words said too late to be useful. She moved on quickly. I stayed still. I never spoke badly about her to Daniel, not once. I thought that was the right thing to do. I thought time would sort the rest out. But time has a way of hardening stories when you're not there to tell your side. When Daniel told me he was getting married, I was genuinely happy for him. I congratulated him, asked about the proposal, told him how proud I was. "You'll be there, right?" he asked, almost as an afterthought. "Of course," I said. I wouldn't miss it. The invitation arrived a month later. Cream-colored envelope, elegant script, my name spelled correctly. I remember noticing that detail as if it mattered more than it should have. Still, there were small things, little absences I tried not to read into. I wasn't asked to help with planning, wasn't invited to the rehearsal dinner until the last minute. When I offered to give a speech, Daniel hesitated. "We'll see," he said. "Things are pretty full."
I told myself it was normal, that this was his day, that my role had changed and that was okay. But sitting there in the back row of the chapel, listening to the music swell, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit before. I hadn't just been invited to my son's wedding. I had been placed, and whatever story Daniel believed about me, whatever version of me he'd grown up hearing, it had decided exactly where I belonged. I stared at the empty altar and wondered when exactly I'd been moved this far back in my own son's life.
As the guests continued to fill the chapel, I sat still, watching the aisle like it might offer an explanation if I stared long enough. That's when I noticed something else. The front rows were filling up with people I barely recognized. Friends of my ex-wife, distant relatives from her side, co-workers of her new husband. They laughed easily, leaned into one another, passed tissues, and whispered jokes. They looked comfortable, entitled to the space. My ex-wife, Laura, appeared near the front just as the music softened. She wore a pale blue dress, tailored perfectly, her hair swept back the way she always wore it for important events. She didn't look in my direction, not once. Beside her sat Mark, her husband, the man she'd met less than a year after we separated. He adjusted his cufflinks, leaned in to say something that made her smile. They were placed squarely in the front row, directly facing the altar. The father of the groom was sitting behind a pillar. I swallowed and shifted in my seat, the wood creaking under my weight. My palms were damp. I wiped them discreetly on my trousers and forced my shoulders to relax. I told myself not to make a scene, not today. The past has a way of creeping up when you least expect it. As I sat there, the quiet before the ceremony stretching thin, I found myself drifting backward. After the divorce, Laura and I had agreed on joint custody. Daniel was 16 then, old enough to have opinions, young enough to be shaped by them. At first, things were balanced. Weekends with me, dinners together, homework at the kitchen table. But slowly, the balance shifted. Laura started suggesting it was easier for Daniel to stay at her place during the week, closer to school, less driving. It made sense. I didn't argue. Then came the comments, casual, almost thoughtful. "Your dad's pretty set in his ways," she'd say, according to Daniel. "He's not great with change." Or, "He's always been more focused on work. That's just who he is." None of it was a lie, exactly, but none of it was the whole truth either. I tried to compensate the only way I knew how, by showing up. I never missed a game, never forgot a birthday. When Daniel needed money for textbooks, I transferred it without question. When his car broke down, I drove across town in the rain to tow it home myself. But teenagers don't measure love in miles driven or bills paid. They measure it in presence. And somehow, even when I was there, I was already fading. When Laura married Mark, things shifted again. Mark was warm, talkative. He took Daniel fishing, brought him concert tickets, helped him pick out a suit for prom. He filled space easily. I told myself there was room for all of us. I didn't realize how much of my place had already been rewritten. The string quartet stopped playing. A hush fell over the chapel. Guests stood. I rose with them, my heart thudding harder than it should have. Daniel appeared at the front, standing beside his best man. He looked older than I remembered. Broader shoulders, a steadiness to him that made my chest ache with pride. He didn't look at me. His gaze flicked to the front row instead, toward Laura and Mark. Laura reached up and touched his arm. Mark nodded, something passing between them I couldn't hear. The bride entered. The ceremony began. I tried to focus, tried to be present, but my mind kept snagging on small details. Mark was listed in the program. Mark Reynolds, stepfather of the groom. My name appeared below it. Just my name. No title, no acknowledgement. It shouldn't have mattered. Words on paper, formalities, but it felt deliberate, like a careful erasing. As the officiant spoke about family, about the people who shaped the couple into who they were, I felt a quiet pressure building behind my eyes. I blinked it away. I would not cry here, not over this. Then came the moment that finally made everything clear. The officiant asked the parents to stand. Laura stood immediately. Mark rose beside her. For a brief, stupid second, I waited for Daniel to turn, to look for me, to realize something was missing. He didn't. The officiant smiled at the front row. "Thank you," he said warmly. I remained seated in the back. No one noticed.
And in that moment, I understood something with painful clarity. This wasn't an oversight. This was a story my son had been told for years, one where my absence had been rewritten as indifference, my quietness mistaken for neglect, a story where another man had been given my lines, my cues, my place at the front. The ceremony continued. Vows were exchanged. Applause filled the room. I clapped too, slowly, carefully, my hands moving out of habit. But inside, something had shifted. I realized I had a choice to make, not about where I was sitting, but about whether I would continue playing a role someone else had written for me. And I knew, with a strange calm settling over me, that whatever I did next would change everything.
The reception was held at a restored barn on the edge of town. All white lights and reclaimed wood, the kind of place that smelled faintly of lavender and polished oak. I arrived early, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with myself. I watched as staff adjusted centerpieces and tested microphones. Glasses clinked softly as they were set in neat rows. The place was beautiful, thoughtfully arranged, every detail considered, except, it seemed, where I belonged. I found my name on a small white card near the entrance to the dining area, Table 11. It was tucked near the back, close to the kitchen doors. I didn't recognize most of the names around it. Co-workers of Laura's, friends of Mark's, people whose lives had intersected with my son's only recently. At the head table, Daniel and his new wife sat between Laura and Mark on one side and her parents on the other. I stood there for a moment, card in hand, listening to laughter ripple across the room. I thought about leaving. The idea settled into me quietly, like a suggestion rather than an impulse. I could slip out before dinner, leave a card. No one would stop me. It would confirm everything Daniel already believed, that I was distant, disengaged, unwilling to make the effort. Instead, I took a slow breath and sat down at table 11. Dinner passed in fragments. Polite conversation, forced smiles. I ate the chicken without tasting it, nodded at stories that didn't involve me. Every so often I glanced toward the head table. Daniel laughed easily there, relaxed, like someone who felt supported. After dessert, the lights dimmed. The MC tapped the microphone, asking for attention. "Before we open the dance floor," he said, "we have a few words from the parents." Laura stood first. She smoothed her dress, took the microphone, and smiled through damp eyes. She spoke about Daniel's childhood, his curiosity, his kindness, the way he'd always looked out for others. She talked about sacrifices, about doing it alone for a long time, about how proud she was of the man he'd become. The room applauded warmly. Then Mark stood. "I came into Daniel's life later," he said, his voice confident, practiced. "But from the moment I met him, I knew he was something special. I just tried to be there for him, support him, love him like my own." More applause. People glanced at Daniel, at Laura, at Mark. A perfect picture. The MC looked down at his list. "And now," he said, hesitating, "we'd like to invite—" He stopped, looked confused, scanned the paper again. Laura leaned over and whispered something. The MC nodded slowly. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "we'll move on to the next part of the evening." That was it. No speech from me, no acknowledgement that I existed at all. I felt the room tilt slightly, like a boat shifting its weight. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with something heavier, a deep, bone-level sadness. I stood up. The movement was small, but it caught the attention of the people at my table. A few heads turned. I didn't rush. I straightened my jacket, picked up my glass, and walked toward the MC. Laura's eyes widened when she saw me. Mark stiffened. Daniel looked confused. "I'm sorry," I said quietly to the MC. "May I say a few words?" There was a pause, the kind that stretches longer than it should. The MC glanced at Daniel. Daniel hesitated, then nodded. I took the microphone. The room fell silent. I didn't clear my throat, didn't smile. I just spoke. "I wasn't sure if I was going to do this," I said, my voice steady, surprising even me. "I realized tonight that if I don't speak now, I probably never will." I looked at Daniel, really looked at him. "I want you to know that I'm proud of you,
Not for who you are today, but for who you've always been. Even when things were complicated, even when we didn't always understand each other. I paused, letting the words settle. I also want to say this, I added gently. There are many ways to tell a story about a family. Some are loud, some are quiet. Some leave things out without meaning to. Others do it on purpose. A murmur rippled through the room. I've always believed that love isn't about taking up space. It's about showing up again and again, even when you're placed in the back. I set the microphone down. I didn't wait for applause. I walked back to my table, picked up my coat, and left the reception without another word. Outside, the night air was cool. I stood under the string lights for a moment, listening to music swell behind me, and felt something loosen inside my chest. For the first time in years, I hadn't tried to squeeze myself into someone else's version of me. I drove home alone, the road empty, the radio off. And somewhere between the barn and my front door, I understood that the choice I'd made, quiet, dignified, final, was gonna force a reckoning. Not tonight, but soon.
The reckoning came 3 days later. It arrived in the form of a knock at my door just after sunset. The kind of knock that wasn't aggressive but wasn't casual either. Measured, careful. I knew who it was before I opened it. Daniel stood on the porch, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders slightly hunched like he used to get when he was bracing for bad news. He looked tired, older than he had at the wedding. The confidence I'd seen at the head table was gone. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied. We stood there for a moment, the porch light buzzing faintly above us. I stepped aside and let him in. He looked around the house like he hadn't been there in years, even though that wasn't true. The familiar things seemed to catch him off guard. The framed photo of us at the lake, the old bookshelf, the faint smell of coffee and wood cleaner. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me," he said. "I'm here," I answered. It was the simplest truth I had. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where he'd done homework, where we'd eaten pancakes on Sunday mornings. I poured us both coffee, even though it was late. My hands were steady. "I didn't plan for it to happen that way," he said, finally, staring into his cup. "At the wedding." "I know," I said, and I meant it. "Most things like that aren't planned." He flinched slightly, like the words had landed harder than he expected. "Mom's really upset. She thinks you embarrassed her. Mark, too." I nodded once. I figured. But he hesitated. "I can't stop thinking about what you said." Silence settled between us. Thick, but not hostile. Just full. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." I met his eyes. "I will be." "Were you absent," he asked, "when I was growing up? I mean, really absent?" There it was, the question that had been hovering over us for years, finally spoken out loud. I didn't rush to answer. "I was tired," I said carefully. "I worked a lot. I wasn't always good at talking about feelings, but I was there. I never chose to be gone." He swallowed. "Mom always said you didn't fight very hard after the divorce, that you were relieved." I felt something tighten in my chest, but I kept my voice even. "I fought in the ways I knew how, quiet ways. I didn't want you in the middle of it. I didn't want you thinking you had to choose." He shook his head slowly. "She said you let her take over, that you stepped back. I stepped back so you wouldn't feel pulled apart. There's a difference." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face with both hands. "I don't know what's true anymore," he admitted. "Everything just made sense the way it was, until the wedding." I watched him then, not as the groom, not as the man shaped by other people's stories, but as my son, the boy who used to fall asleep in the car on long drives, the teenager who pretended not to need me, but always lingered a little longer when I dropped him off. "I'm not asking you to take sides," I said gently. "I'm not asking you to rewrite your life. I just want you to understand there's more than one version of the past." He nodded slowly. "I think I knew that," he said. "I just didn't want to look too closely." We sat there a while longer, talking, not arguing, just untangling, piece by piece. Before he left, he stood in the doorway and turned back to me. "I'm sorry for the seating, for the speech,
for not seeing it sooner. I felt the weight of the apology. Not dramatic, not complete, but real. "Thank you," I said. "That matters." After he left, I stood alone in the quiet house. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Life went on. But something had shifted. The truth had surfaced. Not loudly, not publicly, but enough to change the shape of things. The consequences weren't immediate. Laura didn't call. Mark didn't apologize. But the story they'd told no longer stood uncontested. Daniel started calling more often, asking questions, remembering things out loud. And slowly, carefully, a new version of our relationship began to form. Not based on blame or erasure, but on honesty. It wasn't perfect, but it was real.
The weeks after that conversation were quiet in a new way. Not awkward, not strained, just intentional. Daniel started calling on Sunday afternoons. Sometimes he had a reason. Questions about work, advice about fixing something in the apartment he and his wife had rented. Other times he didn't. We talked about small things. A movie he'd watched, a recipe he'd ruined, the sound of rain through the phone line. Once, he asked me to tell him about the maple tree out front. He said he'd driven past the house recently and noticed how big it had gotten. "It's taller than the roof now," I told him. "Clogs the gutters every fall." He laughed. "Some things don't change." "No," I said, "they don't." A month after the wedding, he came over for dinner. I cooked pasta, too much of it as usual. We ate at the kitchen table, the same one where so much of our life had unfolded. His wife came too. She was kind, attentive in a quiet way. She watched us carefully, like she understood she was stepping into something fragile. After dinner, Daniel helped me with the dishes. We stood side by side at the sink, the way we used to when he was younger. The sound of running water filled the spaces between us. "I talked to Mom," he said suddenly. "I didn't stop washing." "How did that go?" He exhaled slowly. "Not great, but honest." I nodded. That was more than I'd expected. "She said she was protecting me," he continued, "that she thought you'd disappear if she didn't step in." "And what do you think?" I asked. He glanced at me. "I think she was protecting her version of the story." We let that sit. He dried his hands and leaned against the counter. "I wish I'd seen it sooner." You saw it when you were ready. That's all any of us can do." He looked at me then, really looked at me, with something new in his eyes. Not guilt, not obligation, recognition. Before he left that night, he hugged me. Not the quick, polite kind, the kind that lingers a second longer than expected. "I want you in our lives," he said quietly. "Not in the back, not on the sidelines." My throat tightened. I managed to nod. "I'm here. I always have been." Laura never apologized. Mark stopped reaching out entirely. There were consequences, but they weren't dramatic. They were subtle. Invitations that included me now. Conversations that shifted tone. The unspoken understanding that Daniel was no longer accepting a single version of the past. Truth doesn't always explode. Sometimes it just takes up space. And once it does, it's hard to push it back out. I didn't win anything. I didn't reclaim a title or a front row seat. What I gained was quieter than that. I gained my voice. I learned that dignity doesn't come from being acknowledged. It comes from knowing when to stand, when to speak, and when to walk away without bitterness. I still think about that moment in the chapel sometimes. The usher's hand, the back row, the way I folded myself into that seat like it was what I deserved. But now, when I remember it, I don't feel shame. I feel clarity, because that day I made a choice, not to fight, not to accuse, not to beg for space, but to tell the truth without raising my voice. And in doing so, I gave my son something no seating chart ever could, the chance to see his father clearly. Life doesn't always correct itself in grand gestures. Sometimes healing comes in coffee at the kitchen table, in Sunday phone calls, in a grown man finally asking the question he was afraid to hear the answer to. If you've ever been pushed to the back of someone else's story, invited but not included, know this: your worth isn't measured by where they place you. It's measured by how you carry yourself when they do. Would you have spoken up the way I did, or would you have stayed silent? Tell me in the comments. And if stories like this resonate with you, stories about family, truth, and quiet strength, consider subscribing. You're not alone in these moments.